Anyway, Johnny asked me to present on art and geography, and actually thinking about it and anticipating, although Meg and I have not spoken at all about this, that maybe talking about interrelations or crossings, as it were, between disciplines is maybe not so exciting as talking about how we can actually all learn from each other. So maybe it should be a bit more provocative and do art is geography, or geography is art for that matter. So I actually want to begin with this image from really actually one of the key books of feminist geography from 1993 or something like that, Feminism and Geography by Gillian Rose. And of course we see on the cover of it a Barbara Kruger piece of art, We Won't Play Nature for Your Culture is the title of it. And I bring that up for a few reasons. First of all, it shows that I'm not the first person to think about linking geography with art, just in case anybody thought I was. I hope nobody actually thought that. But I also bring it up because I think this is also an example of exactly what Meg was talking about, this sort of using art to illustrate, using art to complicate, because art's great for that, because it's kind of non-rational, not irrational, but non-rational. It's not making a full argument. Art is very good for asking questions, for destabilizing, for complicating, for problematizing, and that's great. We all love artists for doing that. And then, scientists, and I guess around here I'm a scientist, and sort of have different roles in different places, but fine, I'll play the scientist, okay? Scientists then kind of come in and then they sort of make sense of it again, after the artist has shocked us. So maybe they don't make things sexy, maybe they make things shocking, or maybe shocking is sexy, who knows? That gets us back to ideas having sex, and we don't want to go back there, do we? Anyway, an example of that, it's kind of, art becomes a tool. Art is a tool that is used by geographers to draw attention, to illustrate, etc. And I've got a lot of problems with that. Partly, of course, I'm in a room full of artists, and it's not really nice to call you all tools. But I actually also think when we think of art as a tool, we miss the potential of what both artists and geographers can learn from each other and can contribute to each other. And so that's why, instead of looking at what art can do for geography, I want to actually talk about some of the links between them. And it's not really that hard to see the links, because in fact, you take the actual word geography, it literally means earth writing, right? Geography, right? Earth write. And earth writing is, kind of something that a whole lot of artists do in one way or another. The most extreme, obvious case might be somebody like Schmidt's Spiral Jetty, where of course he is literally writing, inscribing something onto the earth here, taking earth to make more earth, etc. And of course, a lot of artists, arguably even all artists, not only write on the earth, they also use earth to write. And you could even say silicon is, as we just learned from the previous presentation, made of earth also. So even digital artists, in their own way, are writing with earth. It's obviously more clear here. But geography is not just about earth, it's also about space and making spaces and understanding what goes on in spaces, how spaces limit our actions, how we produce spaces and conflict over spaces in everyday lives. And that's actually an issue it's a big deal in art as well, because actually every work of art involves the creation of a space. Actually, it involves the creation of several spaces. It involves the creation of the art object that's being created, but it also creates a space in which the viewer and the object themselves interact and create a new kind of interaction space. And so, so there's all these spaces that are being created here. And I think because artists have a long history of doing this, of being very actually self-conscious about space creation. When you sit down with take the classic case of the blank canvas, you're thinking about, wow, what kind of space will I create here, and what are the limits to the spaces I can create? Limits for me as a producer, but also limits for the viewer down the line. And so even if you look at, say, some kind of very classic, seemingly simplistic depiction of space in a landscape painting, even here, there's on the one hand the desire to create a realistic depiction, as you have in landscape art, the sort of almost photo-like realism. And then on the other hand, it's of an obviously imaginary space. In fact, I love the title of this, arguably the first landscape painting, Fanciful Landscape, which is an interesting contradiction because landscape implies reality picture. That's how we all sort of learn what landscape art is. And yet right from the beginning saying, no, it's not really real. It's not really a representation of anything. Or it's a representation of the techniques of viewing, but it's not a representation of an actual place. And to say artists, I think, have for quite a long time been cognizant of that, been thinking about the limits of representation, how art is representational and non-representational at the same time. And we often talk about a division between them, but as we see, that blurring of the representational and the non-representational has been around for quite some time. Geographers have kind of only much more recently come to issues of non-representationalism. You know, we still tend to think of ourselves as scientists, and science is about depiction and representation and, you know, creating a simulacra of the world so that you can then do an experiment on it, so you can then know more about the world, so you can apply it later. Basically all the stuff that was on Meg's wonderful flowchart that nobody really does. And so we look at, you know, classic geographic representation. Of course, the standard representation in geography is the map. And, you know, you can see this obviously has a much more clear connection with reality. You can spot your house on there somewhere. But it also has very real implications. I mean, if you have a kid, or you are a kid in Leon County, this map tells you where you're going to go to school. So that's really important. But like, say, the landscape painting or any work of art, you know, maps are always partial stories. They actually construct places and they leave things out. I mentioned this is a map of showing where kids go to school, but there are no kids, and there's actually not even any schools on the map. It's kind of intriguing. Actually, they could have put the schools in, but they weren't important because, you know, for the purpose of these particular planners, it's a whole lot easier to work with abstract space with nothing in it. And then you can just sort of shift the lines around. So not only, obviously, you don't have politics and racial disparity and sense of what's a good school or anything like that, and say you don't even have kids or schools on here. But that's fine for this purpose. But is this representational? You know, is this representational of the act of going to school, of what the kid will experience in school? You know, does this give you memories of getting beat up on the way to school, or, you know, being proud of your grades or anything like that? It's really debatable whether you see any of that in a map like this. So there are all these connections between art and geography, between art objects and maps, and yet we still tend to think of there being a fairly clear distinction between them. Here we have two representations of the London Bridge, and I think it's all pretty clear, you know, which one's the art one and which one's the geography one. The one on the left is the art. Clear on that. And yet, it's not always so clear where art stops and geography begins, or even which is which. Staying in London, we have two further London. I don't know, I was on a London phase this morning when I put this talk together. And here we have, you know, your first reaction is the one on the left is art, and the one on the right is a map. In fact, the one on the left is a map of commuting times to central London from various areas in metropolitan London. The one on the right, some of you are probably familiar with, The Great Bear by Simon Patterson, builds off of the sort of the foundation of the London Underground map to show how all kinds of things in the world that you never thought were connected are connected to each other. And so different subway lines are philosophers or solar systems. And there's all this logic to how they all intersect. So it's a kind of a network depiction of the world, but it's not a map in the sense that it georeferences at all. So we're beginning to see that some of these same limits, there are similarities in the grammar of the map and art, and there are similarities in the problems of representation that face them both, because they're both partial pictures in all cases, to the point where sometimes it's not even clear where one begins and where the other ends. Another point I want to bring up that is, again, I think faced in both art and in geography, and most interestingly in the intersection of them, is that they not only have problems of either representing or not representing worlds out there, they also bring you into the picture. And that itself is problematic. And a great example of this is the classic "you are here" map. Because of course you're not there. You know, even if you're looking at a map of where you are and there's an arrow that says "you are here," you're not there, you're here. You're not like hanging out on a piece of paper. That's actually a Tennessee-North Carolina border, and I'm definitely not there, but that's not the point. It could be a map of Tallahassee, it could be a map of this building, and I'd look at the map, and that's not where I am. And so there's a whole negotiation process going on. This is a representation of where I am, which means the you that is there is a representation of me, but it's not really representing it because it's not really the place that I am. And so you're sort of going through this constant negotiation of where you are and where you're not. And this is a topic that artists deal with quite frequently, especially artists dealing with quite self-consciously geographic material like maps or mapping iconography or geographic references of any sort, which when you put all that together actually encompasses a whole lot of art. Take, for example, two artists who actually have played with that "you are here" type thing. And I would call both of these map art. They're not working with maps per se, but they're certainly working with map iconography in both cases. And these are actually both interesting cases because they're doing something very similar. In both instances, you know, we talk about being located on the map, being, you know, putting yourself on the map. And what's going on here is that, in a sense, the map is being put onto you. So the map is being drawn to reality rather than reality being drawn onto the map. Which of course gets you to completely rethink what is the representation and what is the reality, and that's the point of what's going on there. A number of cartographic theorists have discussed in this sort of problems of representation. I mean, classically maps are seen as representational, like art, and any of the folks saying, no, it's not really representational. It's non-representational because it's not a reality out there that's being shown, it's being depicted, and in fact a reality is being created. And yet, cartographic theorists also point out that, you know, there still is an active representation. You still work with a map by trying to put yourself on the map. And therefore, been a number of folks in the last few years writing about how, in fact, maps are more than representational. It's not that they're representational or non-representational, but they bring you onto the map. They construct a new reality, so they are representational, but in a sort of post facto way. In which case, I would call these more than representational, because they're actually going in another place, putting you on the map, and then putting the map onto you, so the map becomes your reality. Interestingly, I think the one place where these intersections between geography and art have kind of been lagging in a lot of ways is in the study of art on maps, which is, you know, kind of probably where you first think that's where art and, oh yeah, art and geography, yeah, sure. Maps, they're cool art, or they have cool art on them. And some of this is, I think, historical in the ways in which historians and geographers and artists and their various mixes, like art historians, like, have looked at maps. Typically, historians of cartography have focused on the accuracy of the representation. You know, is that really what the coastline of Iceland looks like, and what led that cartographer to think that? And then you have art historians who look at the sea monsters and, you know, sort of look at them in the context of 16th century aesthetics and compare them to the gargoyles on cathedrals at the same time, or tapestries, or something like that. And yet, if, as I've been saying, kind of this whole distinction between art and mapping, between the art object and the map, is itself blurry, you know, if that's not a clear distinction, then how can we really talk about art that is doing something other than the map function? You know, the art and the map, which again I'm not quite sure how to define, are functioning really together to create a more than representational non-representation of a place. Is sort of a way to put it in a really confusing, contorted way. And that's actually, just to kind of give a plug for some of my own work, is looking at that area. So for instance, some work that I do gets into sea monsters and looks at their biotic, the green one. I think it's here. Sea monsters per square millimeter. That's a set of maps that I do have the Steinberg sea monster index. It's known as, I'm really scared that someday what I'll be famous for. But But anyway, and you know, I could go on and on about what's going on in a chart like this. But the point is that we're treating these representations, they're not arbitrary. This is what's typically seen as the artistic, stylistic, arbitrary sort of fluff around the sides. And you know, it's not fluff, but it also shouldn't be seen as the high art. You know, I mean, of course, we can look at that in the development of art, and you know, I'm sure there've been art historians who've done the, you know, the changing look of a sea monster, things like that. But actually, look at what they tell us about the spaces that they're representing, and what those societies think about those spaces. In this particular case, I'm kind of tracing changes in views of the ocean from 1500 to 1800 by looking at the random, quote-unquote, random stuff that's thrown in the ocean. And of course, it's not random. They're all there for certain reasons, depicting certain things. Is that art? Is that mapping? You know, I'm not quite sure. It's both, and that's sort of the point, that it doesn't matter. Art and maps together are things that we work through to understand and depict and attempt to represent the spaces in which we're located. Last set of examples I want to talk about is that in recognizing these linkages between art and mapping, they get us thinking about the limits of both and the limits of representing anything. One area I've sort of been involved in a lot is how there's really no way to represent mobility in the ways that we're used to doing representation, having static, flat, two-dimensional, and arguably in a lot of other ways too. Mobility is just something that's incredibly important in our everyday lives, as we learned from the Oxford guy. I don't remember his name, but you know, the video we just saw. But at the same time, it's something we really can't capture. Yeah, you draw lines on a map, but that tells you almost nothing about the movement that's actually happening, the experience of movement, where you're going, or the hardships or joys or whatever of it. Here we have two pieces of work, actually both based on the New York City subway map, so we're getting a little closer to home here. The first one, the New York artist Nina Khatchadorian has taken the New York City subway map and literally cut out all of the lines of the routes on the map, and then sort of reconstituted them inside her palm. And her point there is movement is actually a very internal thing. You know, we think of movement as it's out there, it's these between spaces out there, and yet movement is a very embodied function. You know, it's something that could be boring, it could be exciting, it could be hot, it could be cold, it could be enervating, you know, it can be all these things, but it's within you. It's not just out there, even if you're moving through space out there. The second piece by Matthew Knudsen, who actually is both a geographer and an artist, and a librarian, by the way. He's the assistant map librarian at the New York Public Library. This is his day job. We all have weird day jobs. It's his. But what he's done is the exact opposite with the New York City subway map. He's actually whited out all the routes. So all you have are these, you know, quite literally floating signifiers, these signs that point to routes that don't exist. And his point is, well, you know, basically the lines don't exist anyway. You know, the lines tell you so little about what really is going on in movement. Let's just take the lines away and, you know, show you just how useless a map is. In a lot of ways, both of these are showing you, look at just how useless a map is for actually getting somewhere. You take it away and you're not really missing that much. Anyway, these get to showing, again, a specific limit in how we think of space, how we can depict space, how we represent it, whether through art or maps or some fusion of the two. There are real limits to what's going on. And that takes me to my very last point. I want to return to the image that we began with at the beginning. Something that probably nobody noticed when I put this book up before is the subtitle of the book, Feminism and Geography, The Limits of Geographical Knowledge. Because a lot of what I've been talking about, I think these past 15 minutes, have been about limits. Limits in how we depict spaces, limits in how we represent them, limits in how we think of them, ultimately limits in how we know them. You know, there's only so much knowing we can do if we're unable to take an image of something and to bring it home to us. And again, I think that's an issue that artists are constantly coping with. I mean, that's almost what makes art art, is that nothing is completely reproducible. Reality is not reproducible. And in a lot of ways, that's what makes a map too. Of course, is that a map is not reality. A map is a partial depiction of reality that serves some purpose for you. And I would say that would even be true of geographic knowledge as a whole. Geographic knowledge is the knowledge of space and place and relations and Earth and all that stuff, and ultimately none of that adds up to the whole. And in that sense, I think geographers and artists can learn an awful lot from talking to each other, because we're really in very many ways dealing with these same issues. And I might add, just to finish, pointing back to Meg, they also make really cool pictures. Thanks.